Hey, everyone. It is Friday, January 23rd, 2026, and we have a major update on Iran. Let's level set where we are. The whole world is waiting to see what the Americans are going to do. President Trump was on Air Force One just yesterday, and here is what he had to say.
Things stand with Iran. The U.S. has got sizable military assets.
You know, we have a lot of ships going that direction, just in case. We have a big flotilla going in that direction, and we'll see what happens. We have a big force going toward Iran. I'd rather not see anything happen, but we're watching them very closely. I stopped 837 hangings on Thursday. They would have been dead. Every one of them would have been hung. This is like from 1,000 years ago. This is an ancient culture. Very smart people, by the way, but it's an ancient culture. 837, mostly young men, were going to be hung on Thursday. And I said, if you hang those people, you're going to be hit harder than you've ever been hit. It'll make what we did to your Iran nuclear look like peanuts. And an hour before this horrible thing was going to take place, they canceled it. And they actually said they canceled it. They didn't postpone it. They canceled it. So that was a good sign. But we have an armada. We have a massive fleet heading in that direction. And maybe we won't have to use it. We'll see.
You said would you like the supreme leader to step down or to go into exile?
Right now, I don't want to get into that. But
Okay, so this is a huge story. An American fleet has headed towards Iran. In fact, it's really arrived. We're seeing reports from open source information yesterday. Here's Ayu Nasir. Breaking news, they're here. The U.S. strike naval force led by aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln has arrived in the Arabian Sea near Iran. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class nuclear supercarrier, is a major move of the U.S. forces from the South China Sea to the Middle East. And it is coming right in there to face off against Iran. Now, this could be directly related to what we were just talking about, that the Qataris and the Saudis said that you can't use their territory as a launching pad, and you can't use their airspace. So, President Trump, and I pointed this out in one of the earlier updates, I don't think President Trump likes to be told what he can and can't do by states that he's really guaranteeing the security of. And while he's not going to necessarily say something publicly to rupture the relationship with the Qataris and the Saudis, I'm sure the message was sent. And now we have this aircraft carrier, which has F-35s, it's very advanced, and other U.S. military assets in the region are amassing as well. Let's take a look at some of the other info we have coming out of the area. So here is a story from Fox: inside Trump's Iran warning and the unexpected pause that followed. And right there at the beginning of the story, look at this. U.S. and regional security experts say the decision was driven by caution, not retreat. A strike risked retaliation against U.S. forces in Israel. It also raised questions about who would follow in Iran's leadership. But then later on, it mentions in the story the fact that it reiterates the fact that President Trump did say that he would come to the aid of the protesters. A U.S. aircraft carrier is currently steaming toward the Gulf. That we just talked about that. And, this really signals that, yes, the U.S. is still planning to attack. Now, here is Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He is a former IDF international spokesperson and a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And let's take a look at his briefing on what he thinks is going to happen. This is someone, and I could tell you, someone who lives in Israel. Jonathan Conricus is as well informed about what is happening militarily in the Middle East as anybody in the world. So let's listen carefully to his briefing on the situation.
And joining us now for more is Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He's the former IDF international spokesperson. He's now a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we just heard from the Supreme Leader and President Trump. As the saying goes, this time it's personal. This kind of exchange, does you think it bringing us any closer to, for example, a U.S. military action against Iran?
I think it adds to the strategic ambiguity of what the U.S. is going to do, what President Trump is going to order. And I think that the most important parts are the location of military assets, U.S. military assets and capabilities in the region, which have been building clearly over the last few days. And I think that within a matter of days, maybe a week, the U.S. will have all that it needs in position to take meaningful action against Iran, which I personally believe is coming.
All right. Well, let me ask you, what kind of action could we expect? It does seem as if at this stage, perhaps the U.S. won't be targeting Khamenei himself personally, though we never know with President Trump. But what kind of action do you anticipate?
Well, at this stage, I think that the U.S. will have a pretty wide availability of different tools and different actions. I don't think that we will see a Maduro operation because it is much more difficult to get into Iran and get beyond layers of defense in order to actually apprehend a leader. So I would put that aside. And I don't think that we're going to see ground units. I think that we will see eventually standoff fire from aerial platforms, from naval platforms that will hit specific targets that are related to the oppression of the Iranian people. The Basij headquarters, the IRGC headquarters, and other key nodes of command and control, and really the centers of power of the Iranian regime, the same forces that have been basically mowing down Iranians on the streets. We're looking at everywhere between 8,000 and 15,000 people, depending on different reports. It's very difficult to get information out, but we know that thousands have been murdered, mowed down on the streets. I assume that these will be the forces that will be the first target, and then an anticipated Iranian retaliation, whether it's against American troops and assets in the region, and if it includes Israel or not, we'll have to wait and see. And then a follow-up, which I think will indeed target the Supreme Leader Khamenei himself and actually aim by military force to bring down the regime and to allow the protesters who have been out on the streets day in, day out, but then mowed down in the most brutal fashion, to give them the kind of the cavalry is here, and let them know that now is the time to actually take back their country and free themselves from 47 years of the Islamic regime's horrible oppression of the Iranian people.
And how do you expect the regime to react, certainly to an initial attack, or something like the restrained, almost symbolic response we saw last year, or something more serious that, of course, is likely to target Israel?
Well, I think that the U.S. and probably also Israel will be watching that very closely, watching for the indicative signs of opening of silos, preparation of launching of ballistic missiles, and anything that will be indicative of Iranian intentions to fire towards Israel or to fire towards major U.S. assets. If that happens, Israel and the U.S. will have capabilities at hand in order to preempt that. So I don't know exactly what the Iranians will do. I think they have a pretty limited toolbox available, as opposed to a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we would have been talking about, the entire region, about Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and proxies in Syria. But today they're left with missiles and the IRGC and perhaps overseas attacks, none of which are going to save the Iranian regime from what is coming, what I believe is coming, and that is an onslaught on the headquarters, the command and control, and the ability of the Iranian regime to continue to oppress the Iranian people.
Yeah, we do know the U.S. is keeping the diplomacy option on the table, and we heard Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, President Trump's special envoy, just the other day, speaking at a conference, saying we would like to still negotiate with the regime. We even gave out a list of conditions. Some of them were acceptable to Israel. Noticeable, not on the list of conditions, was any move towards protecting the protesters or any kind of real fundamental change
of engagement and different use of force by the regime.
Right. So how likely? I mean, in Israel, you're hearing an expression in Hebrew, "likofo witkof," to attack
Yes.
Witkoff or Witkoff diplomacy?
Yes, well, he is the diplomacy guy. It'll be very surprising if he were to speak about military options. His toolbox is the diplomatic one, and he's someone who has brought significant achievements in the Gaza part of the world and other areas. But I don't think that is where we're going. I think that the actions, the brutality, the way that the Iranian regime chose to oppress the uprising and the protesters, to basically mow them down in cold blood with Basij and IRGC forces, with foreign mercenaries that they brought in from Iraq, from Afghanistan and other places, that is one bridge too far. That is one bloodbath too far. And I think that the personal attacks and the insults out of Khamenei's Twitter account and other accounts against President Trump, he's only digging his hole deeper. And I don't think that those are very wise decisions that have been made to communicate and to entice personally President Trump.
And Jonathan, even if there was such a serious attack, as you said, against key points of the leadership, even taking out perhaps the supreme leader, would that lead to regime change? We know how powerful and entrenched, for example, the IRGC and its various bodies are.
Indeed. And I think that the most important back-channel conversations and the other scenarios that I'm sure are happening now as we speak are different parts of the Iranian regime, the IRGC specifically, but perhaps other parts, perhaps the army. I don't think the Basij, but army and IRGC. There may be, we may see an Egyptian variant of an Iranian Assisi taking power and relieving the supreme leader of his authority and saying, I want to save the country from a foreign onslaught. I want to save us the destruction that is coming, that you have brought upon us. And as a defensive measure, we're now taking control, and this will be a transit to some type of other governance. That's also a point. I agree with you. The Iranian regime is entrenched. It is brutal. It has had a lot of time to, build an oppressive system that is very powerful and still effective. They came close to, breaking, but when that came, they simply notched up the violence,
right.
Used, basically tools of war, machine guns and assault rifles, and mowed down their own people on Iranian streets. That is how desperate they were, which I think is indicative of how weak they really are when they resort to that level of violence. So bottom line, yes, powerful, yes, very varied, and there are different centers of power in the Iranian regime. I wouldn't rule out a scenario of a general or some other strong man that will come in and say, let's save us the trouble of an Iraq scenario or a Libya scenario, and let's transition into something that is a different type of regime, and let's not go all the way of having to have mayhem and anarchy on the streets, which could follow if kinetic force is applied on the centers of gravity of the Iranian regime, and then the people take over. That could become very messy.
All right, could become messy, but of course.
Wow. So, he answered so many questions there that we've been talking about in these updates. Of course, no one knows what's going to happen. But when we talk about will attacks actually bring down the regime, the question is, what would attacks that could bring down the regime look like? What exactly is that? So, Conricus really laid it out that there is such a thing as the right type of kinetic attacks that could bring down the regime. But he also, towards the end, I found this to be the most interesting part of his briefing, was what are the options? And right at the beginning of all this, I pointed out in these updates that my big fear and what could end up happening as the result of all of these protests and the teetering regime is that the regime could look like it fell, but it didn't really fall. And that's basically what he was describing there, where there's basically a military coup. And instead of having mullahs and at the top of the regime and it being this ideologically Islamist regime, it's still a brutal military dictatorship taken over by the top military people who are already the same criminals running the regime right now. And that would still mean that the Iranian people aren't really living in a free country. But the West might accept that because it would mean less chaos. And it would mean that the main existential issue for Israel and the main security issue for America, which is this radical Islamist regime, it wouldn't be a radical Islamist regime anymore. It would certainly be better than what we've had for the rest of us, but it wouldn't necessarily free the Iranian people. So, and of course, bottom line, there are these military assets by the U.S. You saw what he said there, that there's now a kind of surrounding of Iran by various military assets, and it looks like all the pieces are in place to bring down the Iranian regime. Pull back the camera a bit, and this is my, the final point I want to make is that I don't think that President Trump, with all of his grandiose ambitions of reshaping the world and the way he's always had Iran in his sights, going back to his first term when he killed Qasem Soleimani, going back to even before he ran for president, he would always talk about the Iran threat and how Iran can't have nuclear weapons. President Trump has always seen Iran as the evil regime that it is. And I don't think he wants to leave his presidency without finalizing the end of the Iranian regime. I think he would consider it a major historic accomplishment, as it would be. All right, folks, if you're enjoying these updates, please be sure to like, subscribe, follow, share, etc. But also check out all the content going up at Israel 365's YouTube channel, where I put up very important videos for Israel 365 a number of times a week.